December 18th, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Snow fell without mercy. It wasn't the soft, cinematic snow of postcards. It was the wet, heavy kind that swallowed sound, turning the forest into a frozen graveyard of men and machines. Beneath the black pines, the air smelled of smoke, iron, and infection. In a small, dimly lit tent, just 800 meters behind the front line, Oberarzt Heinrich Müller, a 39-year-old German army physician, bent over a captured American medical kit. His gloves were stiff with dried blood, his face hollow from 6 years of war. Inside the kit were familiar instruments: morphine ampules, sulfonamide packets, bandages, plasma bottles, the routine tools of battlefield survival. But then he found something different. 5 small glass vials, each labeled with a strange word: Penicillin. The letters meant nothing to him at first, but fate had just placed into Müller's hands something that would upend everything he'd ever believed about medicine and about the limits of human technology. By December 1944, Müller had become accustomed to futility. His medical post in the Hürtgen forest was little more than a canvas tent and a few dugout bunkers, reeking of iodine and despair. Every day was the same: triage, amputate, disinfect, wait. He had performed over 300 amputations that year alone. Most weren't from the initial wounds. They were from the infections that followed: gangrene, peritonitis, sepsis. Invisible enemies that consumed the living faster than bullets. The numbers haunted him. He knew them by heart. Abdominal wounds with peritonitis, 90% mortality. Compound fractures with gas gangrene, 75% mortality. Chest wounds with empyema, 60% mortality. Simple infected wounds, 30% mortality. 30%, even with immediate medical care. War medicine, for all its brutality, was supposed to save lives. Yet Müller felt like he was running a statistical execution line. Behind every number was a name, a young soldier who had survived the artillery, only to die 5 days later shaking with fever, whispering, "Es brennt, it burns," before slipping into septic shock. Germany's medical dead end. To understand Müller's despair, we must understand what medicine looked like in 1944. Despite the modern image of the German war machine, tanks, rockets, jets, its medical science lagged behind in one crucial area: infection control. Their 3 main defenses were sulfonamide drugs, introduced in 1935, the first synthetic antibacterial agents, moderately effective but toxic in high doses. Surgical debridement, physically cutting away infected tissue, often requiring amputation. Antiseptic washes, iodine, phenol, or carbolic acid, which killed bacteria but also destroyed living flesh. It was a brutal calculus: kill the infection, kill part of the man. And by late 1944, even these meager supplies were running out. German industry, choked by Allied bombing, could no longer sustain consistent medical logistics. Hospitals reused bandages, sterilized scalpels with burning alcohol, and treated hemorrhages with diluted saline instead of plasma. The Wehrmacht's medical infrastructure, once the pride of Europe, was collapsing under the weight of total war. 2 days earlier, on December 16th, American forces had launched a counterattack that would later become part of the infamous Battle of the Bulge. The forest erupted. Artillery turned the soil into clouds of shrapnel and bone. Müller's aid station was briefly overrun, then retaken after 6 chaotic hours. The Americans had retreated hastily, leaving behind crates of medical supplies. Now, 2 days later, Müller inventoried the spoils. Most of it was standard: sulfa powder, morphine, plasma, bandages. But the penicillin, that word, penicillin, caught his attention. He turned the vials over in his hands. The yellowish powder shimmered faintly under the lantern. The English instructions were simple: reconstitute with sterile water, inject intramuscularly every 3 hours, continue for at least 5 days. Every 3 hours? To Müller, that was absurd. No drug required such constant administration. And for 5 full days? That would consume an impossible quantity of medicine. Still, he had heard whispers. Allied broadcasts and captured journals had mentioned a mysterious mold drug capable of curing infections once thought fatal. But such rumors were easy to dismiss, like tales of invisible tanks or miracle weapons. Now, the evidence was in his hands. That night, Müller faced a choice no military manual prepared him for. He had 23 patients in his care. 14 had infected wounds. 5 were dying. If he followed orders, he would log the American drug, seal it, and await transfer to higher command. If he followed his conscience, he might defy protocol and risk court-martial. But orders didn't keep soldiers alive, and Müller had already buried too many boys who had trusted his hands. So he chose. He would test it. Quietly, carefully. 3 patients only, each on the edge of death. Patient 1, Gefreiter Klaus Weber, age 21. Compound femur fracture, infection spreading rapidly, fever 39.2 degrees. Patient 2, Unterarzt Ernst Hartmann, age 27. Shrapnel wound in shoulder, gas gangrene suspected, fever 40.1 degrees. Patient 3, Oberreiter Franz Schmidt, age 24. Abdominal wound, likely peritonitis, near septic shock. Müller noted in his logbook, December 18th, 0800 hours, administered American drug labeled penicillin. Dose, 100,000 units intramuscularly. Repeat every 3 hours per instruction. Observation, uncertain. He expected nothing. He had seen too much to believe in miracles. But the forest outside grew silent that night, as if even the war itself paused to watch what would happen next. December 19th, 1944, 0600 hours. The forest outside Müller's aid station was deathly quiet. Snowflakes drifted like ashes through the shattered branches. Inside the surgical tent, a low kerosene lamp cast trembling shadows across rows of pale faces. Müller moved between the cots, his boots sticking to the frozen mud floor. His breath hung in the air. It had been 22 hours since the first injections. He checked on Gefreiter Klaus Weber first. Weber had been unconscious the previous night, his pulse weak, his wound oozing pus with that unmistakable sweet, rotting smell of anaerobic infection, the smell that meant death. But now, Weber stirred. His fever, once 39.2 degrees Celsius, had dropped to 38.1 degrees Celsius. The swelling in his thigh had decreased. The wound drainage, while still present, was thinner, clearer, a sign of bacterial decline. Müller leaned close, disbelieving. The young soldier's lips moved. Herr Doktor, es tut weniger weh. It hurts less. He had no explanation. He moved on to Unterarzt Ernst Hartmann. Hartmann's shoulder wound had been advancing toward gas gangrene, the worst diagnosis a field doctor could utter. The flesh had swollen grotesquely, the skin marbled with dark purple veins. When pressed, it crackled. Crepitus, a telltale sign of gas-forming bacteria feeding on dying tissue. The standard treatment would have been amputation, immediate, brutal, and often futile. But overnight, something had changed. Swelling had stopped. The skin felt warm, not cold. The gas had subsided. Hartmann opened his eyes and muttered weakly, "Ich kann meinen Arm spüren." I can feel my arm. Müller stared at him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He checked friend Schmidt next, the abdominal case. Schmidt had been near death for days. His belly was rigid, distended, a classic peritonitis. His pulse had been thready, his blood pressure collapsing. Müller had expected to find a corpse. Instead, Schmidt was breathing, shallowly but evenly, his pulse stronger, abdomen slightly softer to the touch. The impossible had begun. By noon, Müller was pacing the narrow aisle between the beds. His hands trembled, not from cold, but disbelief. He'd kept meticulous notes in his logbook, every dosage, every symptom, every vital sign. He knew the rules. German military doctrine explicitly forbade administering unapproved foreign drugs. If the results were reported prematurely, he could be accused of treason, of using enemy substances on German blood. But if he stayed silent, he'd be burying a miracle. He decided to continue the experiment. Every 3 hours, through the night, the injections continued, 100,000 units at a time, drawn from those fragile glass vials. The medical staff whispered among themselves. They had seen infections rage unchecked for weeks. But now, in less than 48 hours, fevers fell, pus cleared, and color returned to faces they had already prepared to cover with blankets. It was, Müller wrote, quote, as if a hand had reached into the blood itself and cleansed it. The third day brought confirmation. Weber's temperature, 37.4 degrees Celsius, normal. His wound, granulating with healthy pink tissue. He was sitting up, eating solid food. Hartmann's gangrene had stopped completely. The gray necrotic tissue had peeled away, revealing red muffle beneath, living tissue. Müller examined the wound with forceps, astonished to find new capillaries forming. In normal infection cycles, that kind of tissue regeneration would take a week or more. It had taken 2 days. Even Schmidt, the abdominal patient with near-certain fatal peritonitis, had improved. His abdomen had softened. Bowel sounds had returned, the sign of life within the belly. He was conscious, responsive, and thirsty. By December 22nd, all 3 were alive, all recovering. No amputations, no sepsis, no deaths. Müller sat down that night and stared at the last remaining vials of penicillin. He realized what he had witnessed wasn't luck. It was chemistry reshaping destiny. He began to record observations methodically, a scientist again, not just a field doctor. His notes read almost like scripture. Bacterial reduction visible within 24 hours. Temperature normalization in 36 hours. Pain reduction preceding drainage improvement. No secondary infection observed. 0 mortality after 96 hours. He underlined the last phrase 3 times. 0 mortality. No medical procedure, no antiseptic, no drug in the Wehrmacht arsenal could claim that. At that moment, Heinrich Müller realized he was standing before the threshold of a medical revolution, one that had already been unfolding behind Allied lines for years. Later historians would uncover the truth Müller could only guess at. Germany had known about penicillin since 1929, when Alexander Fleming first described it in a British journal. German researchers had even replicated the mold, Penicillium notatum, in laboratories in Frankfurt and Berlin during the 1930s. But they had dismissed it. Why? Because they couldn't scale it. Penicillin, as Fleming discovered, was not stable. It spoiled quickly, degraded in heat, and couldn't be extracted efficiently from the mold. The yield was so low that early chemists considered it a curiosity, not a medicine. While Germany was pouring resources into synthetic drugs like sulfonamides, laboratory products that fit perfectly with their chemical industry. The Allies were quietly perfecting a biological one, and that difference between chemistry and biology would decide who lived and who died. Across the Atlantic, in 1941, an unlikely alliance had formed. Oxford University scientists, American pharmaceutical companies, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Together, they developed something Germany couldn't match: deep tank fermentation, a technology that allowed mold to grow in massive steel vats instead of glass dishes. The key ingredient wasn't a rare chemical, it was corn steep liquor, a byproduct of corn starch production in Illinois. This cheap, sticky residue turned out to boost penicillin yield tenfold. From there, the Americans optimized everything, mutating the mold strains through X-ray radiation to force them to produce even more. Within 3 years, U.S. factories were producing billions of units per month. What Müller held in his hand, those few vials captured in the snow, represented a fraction of 1 hour's production from an American facility. It wasn't just a new medicine. It was the birth of industrial biology. By December 23rd, Müller couldn't sleep. He watched his patients, men who should have been corpses, laughing, eating, even writing letters home. He realized something chilling. This wasn't a medical discovery anymore. This was a weapon, a silent weapon that didn't kill enemies. It kept yours alive. For the first time in modern history, survival itself had become an industrial advantage. The Allies could return men to the front in days. Germany could not. The war of steel and fire had become a war of microorganisms, and Germany had already lost. By Christmas Eve, 1944, the forest around Müller's aid station was silent again. The guns had quieted, not from peace, but exhaustion. Inside his tent, 5 soldiers lay recovering, 3 treated with the mysterious American powder called Penicillin, 2 with the standard German protocol of sulfonamide. 3 lived, 2 died. The contrast was absolute, and Müller, a man of science and order, could not ignore the arithmetic. He sat at his crude wooden desk, the candle flickering beside his medical logbook. He had filled 12 pages with fever charts, pulse readings, and wound descriptions. He added one more entry that night, a sentence written in careful, deliberate handwriting. If the enemy possesses this medicine in abundance, then we are fighting a war already lost. In 1944, no weapon, not even the Tiger tank or the V-2 rocket, had the quiet power that penicillin did. It did not explode. It did not roar. It simply erased death. For the Allies, this miracle was not born of luck. It was the result of industrial coordination on a scale never before attempted. From the outside, penicillin seemed like a scientific breakthrough, but its real victory came from something deeper. A merging of science, agriculture, and manufacturing into one unified war machine. By late 1943, the United States had already transformed penicillin from a laboratory curiosity into a strategic resource. The government classified it as war priority number 1. Every pharmaceutical company, from Pfizer to Merck, was ordered to collaborate, not compete. They shared techniques, molds, and fermentation secrets under military oversight, and the results were staggering. In just 18 months, American production jumped from a few thousand doses to over 1 billion units per month. By D-Day, in June 1944, the Allies had enough penicillin to treat every single soldier wounded during the invasion of Normandy. Meanwhile, in Germany, the story could not have been more different. Before the war, Germany had been the world leader in pharmaceuticals. Companies like Bayer, IG Farben, and Hoechst dominated the global chemical industry. They had invented aspirin, synthetic dyes, and sulfa drugs. But by the 1940s, that same chemical empire had become a weapon of war, redirected toward explosives, fuel, and nerve agents. The laboratories that could have produced penicillin were instead synthesizing poison gases and synthetic fuels for the front lines. When German researchers first studied Fleming's discovery in the 1930s, they dismissed it as chemically unstable and impractical. Their industrial mindset preferred predictable chemical synthesis, the logic of factories, not fungi. By 1943, a few scattered German scientists had tried to replicate penicillin, notably at Hobst and the University of Göttingen, but their success was microscopic. Their cultures produced milligrams of the antibiotic at a time, not grams or kilograms. Without the fermentation tanks, the corn steep liquor, or the massive cooperation of industry, they were trying to fill oceans with thimbles. Even when the Wehrmacht Medical Corps realized penicillin's battlefield potential in 1943, it was too late. Germany lacked the one thing the Allies had mastered: biological mass production. What most people don't realize is that penicillin wasn't just discovered, it was found again and again in different corners of the world. And during the war, both sides fought not only over territory, but over mold. In 1942, the U.S. War Production Board launched Project Penicillin, a top-secret effort to find a better strain of penicillium. Soil samples from every continent were collected, from cantaloupes in Illinois to fruit markets in Australia. The winning strain, Penicillium chrysogenum NRRL 1951, was found on a moldy cantaloupe in Peoria, Illinois. It produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original. That single piece of spoiled fruit changed the world. Meanwhile, German researchers, working in isolation, were still cultivating the old, weak Penicillium notatum in shallow glass trays. Without the deep tank process, their yields were microscopic. Even when they captured Allied reports or samples, they lacked the fermenters and nutrients to reproduce the results. Müller's handful of vials, those captured from an American aid station, were likely worth more than gold to German scientists. Each milligram represented a technology they couldn't replicate, no matter how brilliant their chemists were. By the winter of 1944, the difference was measurable, not in theories, but in corpses. Allied casualty infection mortality 1944, wound infection deaths 3%, pneumonia deaths less than 1%, amputation rate for infected wounds 3%. German casualty infection mortality 1944, wound infection deaths 12 to 15%, pneumonia deaths 18%, amputation rate 8%. The numbers are cold, but behind each statistic were men, soldiers who lived or died because of what was, in essence, a mold. Müller would later write in his post-war notes, "We had science. The Americans had factories, and factories, it turns out, can save more lives than science ever could." The secret to America's success wasn't just discovery. It was industrial philosophy. In the United States, even during wartime, government and private companies collaborated. They shared blueprints, microbial strains, and chemical data freely, driven by a single objective: to save Allied lives faster than the Axis could take them. Pfizer developed massive stainless steel fermentation tanks, the size of small houses. Each could produce millions of doses every few days. They used corn steep liquor, a waste byproduct from corn milling, as a growth medium, a brilliant act of wartime improvisation. By contrast, Germany's chemical industry, though advanced, was fragmented and secretive. Each laboratory guarded its findings jealously. IG Farben, Hoechst, Bayer, all operated in silos, competing even under the Nazi regime. This was the crucial difference. The Allies shared their secrets to save lives. The Axis kept theirs and lost them. By January 1945, the divide between the two worlds had become absolute. American medics carried penicillin vials in their field kits as casually as they carried morphine. It was routine, expected, standard. In German hospitals, it was a fantasy. Even the few grams produced by German researchers were used not on frontline soldiers, but on high-ranking officers and government officials. Ordinary soldiers, like those in Müller's aid station, were given sulfonamides and hope, neither of which could stop sepsis. It wasn't a failure of medicine. It was a failure of infrastructure. And for Müller, who had seen with his own eyes what penicillin could do, that realization was unbearable. On December 30th, 1944, Heinrich Müller wrote his final wartime medical entry. He noted the recovery of all 3 patients treated with penicillin and the deaths of the others. He recorded the dosages, intervals, and outcomes, precise, almost clinical, but between the lines there was emotion. He ended his notes with a line that historians would later quote as prophetic. "We have lost this war, not for lack of courage, nor even of science, but for lack of vats and valves and glass pipes. The war was decided in the factories before it was fought in the field." He sent his report up the chain of command. It likely never reached Berlin. The Reich was collapsing. Rail lines were bombed. Communication disintegrating. Somewhere between Aachen and Cologne, the envelope disappeared, lost like millions of other fragments of the war's dying breath. After the war, Müller would be captured by American forces and spend 3 years as a POW. During that time, he was given access to American medical journals and reports. There, in black and white, he saw the full truth confirmed. Every suspicion, every fear. By 1945, American factories were producing over 650 billion units of penicillin. Germany, barely 10 kilograms total that year. Enough to treat fewer than 2,000 people. The invisible weapon that saved more Allied lives than any gun or plane wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to heal. It was, as one historian later wrote, the antibiotic that won the war, not by defeating the enemy, but by keeping its own army alive. Spring 1945. The war was ending, though no one near the front could feel it yet. The air in Germany hung thick with smoke and silence. Towns flattened. Factories bombed to dust, and the once mighty Wehrmacht retreating on every front. For Oberarzt Heinrich Müller, the war's last months were a blur of collapse. The aid stations ran out of plasma, morphine, bandages, and eventually hope. The only thing that didn't run out was death. But Müller kept his notes. He guarded them like sacred scripture. Detailed records of dosages, patient temperatures, wound observations. He didn't know whether the Reich would ever see them, or if anyone would even care. But as a doctor, he couldn't bear to let this knowledge die in the mud. In April 1945, when his unit was overrun near Bonn, Müller surrendered without resistance. He placed his pistol and his notebook side by side on the table. One instrument for killing, the other for understanding, and waited. He spent the next 3 years in an American POW camp near Reims, France. Conditions were strict but humane. The guards were young, polite, and well-fed. A quiet reminder of which side had truly mastered the art of supply. For the first time, Müller saw the war from the other side, not through propaganda, but through data. American medical officers occasionally shared journals and research papers with German doctors in captivity, partly for re-education, partly out of professional respect. When Müller opened his first American medical journal, he froze. There it was, Penicillin Production, United States War Department, 1944. The numbers were overwhelming. By mid-1944, the U.S. had produced 1.6 billion units of penicillin per month. By the end of 1945, that number had reached over 650 billion units annually, enough to treat every Allied soldier and still have reserves to send to civilian hospitals worldwide. Germany's total output that same year? Barely 10 kilograms. 10 kilograms, not per month, not per company, per year. The gulf between the two numbers wasn't merely statistical, it was existential. It revealed the true nature of modern warfare. The nation that can manufacture life faster than the enemy manufactures death wins. Before 1939, most generals believed wars were decided by bravery, strategy, and morale. After 1945, the lesson was clear. Wars were decided by production lines. In the Pacific, radar and industrial logistics had given the Americans sight in the dark. In Europe, antibiotics had given them the power to erase infection, to heal faster, fight longer, and sustain the human machinery of war. For every American soldier who survived a wound, a German equivalent died of infection. It wasn't a matter of heroism or skill. It was chemistry. It was infrastructure. It was industry. And for Müller, that realization was almost unbearable. He wrote in his 1946 POW diary, "In our army, the brave died clean. In theirs, the wounded lived dirty. But the living, even dirty, still march." That was the war's new arithmetic, a calculus of survival, measured not by courage, but by capacity. When Müller was released in 1948, he returned to a Germany that barely existed. Cities were ruins, hospitals had no electricity, but in the rubble, a new idea was forming, one that would transform the next century: industrial medicine, the idea that health itself could be mass-produced. American occupation authorities, aware of what penicillin had accomplished, made the antibiotic one of the first Reconstruction priorities. By 1946, they had shipped over 30 million doses of American penicillin to German hospitals. Not as war reparations, but as humanitarian supply. To Müller, it was a quiet irony. The same medicine that had kept Allied soldiers alive now kept their former enemies from dying of infection in peace. He called it the most merciful victory in history. The post-war years became a revolution. Penicillin's success opened the floodgates. Streptomycin, tetracycline, erythromycin, an entire arsenal of antibacterial weapons. Diseases that had haunted humanity for millennia. Pneumonia, sepsis, syphilis, gangrene fell one by one. For the first time, doctors could reliably cure infection faster than it could kill. Hospitals transformed from places of last resort into engines of recovery. Life expectancy soared. Childbirth deaths plummeted. Surgery became safe. In less than a decade, the world changed more than it had in centuries, and at the center of it all was that small glass vial Müller had first opened in a cold, muddy forest. When historians later analyzed the war, they coined a phrase for what had happened: the penicillin gap. It wasn't simply a gap in medicine, it was a gap in philosophy. Germany, the birthplace of modern chemistry, had viewed biology as imprecise and inefficient. America, by contrast, embraced the messy, living processes of the natural world and scaled them up. Corn-steeped liquor, mold spores, fermentation tanks, these were not glamorous technologies, but they won the war. As one American researcher famously said in 1945, "You can't make penicillin in a test tube. You make it in a barn. That statement encapsulated everything, the humility and the genius of industrialized biology. In 1952, Müller was interviewed by American historians compiling post-war medical reports. His words echoed those of another man from another front, Commander Kaju Segura of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had once said, "We fought the war we trained for. The Americans fought the war their factories built." Müller's version was hauntingly similar. He told his interviewer, "We were not cruel men. We were not ignorant, but we were prisoners of our own precision." The Americans produced penicillin like they produced bullets. That was the true weapon, not the medicine itself, but the means to make it for all. When asked what lesson the world should learn, he paused, then said softly that the future belongs to those who can mass-produce mercy. In the decades that followed, penicillin would save hundreds of millions of lives, soldiers, civilians, children, across every continent. It became the template for modern pharmaceutical production, public health, and global cooperation. But the deeper legacy was philosophical. World War II proved that the line between science and survival no longer ran through the battlefield. It ran through the factory floor. The men who built tanks decided how the war was fought. The men who built antibiotics decided how humanity survived it. And in that silent, sterile world of fermentation vats and glass flasks, the future of civilization quietly began. December 18th, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, a captured medical kit, 5 glass vials. In that moment, one German doctor unknowingly held the blueprint for the next century. Not a bomb, not a bullet, but a cure. He had witnessed something the war could not destroy, the triumph of life over machinery, and the realization that the greatest revolutions in human history begin not with explosions, but with healing. If this story moved you, if you want to understand the forgotten technologies, the silent revolutions, and the people who shaped history from behind the front lines, then don't let this be the end. Our next episode takes you to another hidden battlefield, where engineers, medics, and inventors fought not for glory, but for survival, for progress, for the future we live in today. So stay with us, subscribe, and keep exploring the untold stories of World War II, the science, the strategy, and the sacrifice that defined the modern world. Because history isn't over. It's waiting to be rediscovered, one story at a time.